Well, good afternoon. It's still morning where I'm located. Really nice to be a part of this coffee and canola chat with all of you. My name is Clint Jurke. I work as the Agronomy Director for the Canola Council of Canada, but I'm also a farmer out on the western side of Saskatchewan. I'm almost precisely halfway between Saskatoon and Edmonton. And I'm looking out my window right now, what I would describe as record levels of snowfall. I've got drifts in my yard that are taller than I am. And I have not seen snow quite this much since I was a little kid. So that's really quite encouraging considering the drought that we came out of here last year. So, but I've been asked to chat with you guys about clubroot. And clubroot is always a fun topic, let's say, but it is one in the canola industry that we're most concerned about. So I'll start changing slides here. Hopefully this works okay. So like I said, I work for the Canola Council of Canada. I'm part of a team that are responsible for ensuring that we have enough supply. But if you're not familiar with who the Canola Council is, we're a nonprofit trade association that represents the entire value chain, right from farmers to life science input suppliers, crushers, and exporters. And so our funding comes from farmer groups, particularly Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, as well as the life science companies, the Grain Elevator Association, and the oilseed or crushing industry as well. So as an association, we basically have two jobs at the Canola Council. One is to make sure that we have markets to sell canola into, but second, which is where I'm interested in, is to ensure that we have enough supply to meet those market demands. And we do that by having a team of agronomy specialists, and I'm one of them. I'm here in the sprawling metropolis of Lloydminster on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. I'm one of a team of agronomy specialists that are focused on addressing all of the issues that come up with canola production and try to pave a way for the industry as to how do we meet these challenges and increase our yields and our supply overall. Now, everybody here, I'm sure you are familiar with canola and how awesome it is. And I have just one little bit of information to share with you. Like canola, although maybe is not one of the bigger crops in Ontario, it is a really big deal for Western Canada. Its footprint matches almost what the wheat crop is. If we put all the wheats together, winter, spring, and durum wheats, they're very similar in acreage for the last 10 years. And so this chart here shows the greeny yellow line, that's the wheat acreage. The blue line is canola, and the red line is summer fallow. There's very little summer fallow that's practiced anymore in Western Canada, but it was a very common practice. And canola has essentially replaced the summer fallow acres. And so instead of farmers out here in the West growing wheat, summer fallow, it's now wheat, canola. But unfortunately, that's not a great way of farming, because we now have to deal with clubroot, and clubroot seems to really thrive in those tight rotations of alternating between just two crops. So see that there's quite a few growers here. So I have a question for you as farmers, just to get the creative juices flowing. I want to ask you, if you are farming, how do you know that you don't have clubroot already on your farm? I ask this at almost all farmer meetings that I go to where I'm talking about clubroot, whether it's in Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba. And I believe that it's the same for you in Ontario. How can you be sure that you don't have clubroot? Are you scouting for it regularly? Are you certain that you have a farming operation where there is no soil that could possibly be introduced to your fields? How do you know that it's not already there, that's been lurking in the background for a number of years? The reason why I ask this question is because clubroot has become widespread enough that we need to move to a new paradigm when we're thinking about this disease, a new way of thinking about it, meaning that we should not assume that this is not a problem on my farm. Or at the very least, you should not assume that it's not already in your neighborhood. The chances are that it is likely already well established within your farming area, and it very likely could be on your farm. And therefore, you need to start thinking about managing this disease as something that is there and could be affecting your farming operation. Canola is very valuable to the Canadian economy. I think the latest numbers are that it adds $30 billion to our economy each year, but we see clubroot as being one of the big threats to that, to its economic success. And so we need to make sure that we are managing this disease successfully and to try preventing it from becoming a bigger problem than it already is. So let's take a look at what clubroot actually looks like. Clubroot is ugly. Like if you ever find a plant that has galls like this, then you know you've got a really big problem. This is probably the most severely infected plant I've seen in my career, and I've been looking at clubroot since 2006, and I've not found another plant that was quite as severely infected as this one. This came from just outside of Edmonton area. But what this disease is, it's a soil-borne pathogen that infects the roots of a plant. And what makes it really different than any other root-borne pathogen is that it hijacks the plant's functions. Like the function of a root is basically to do two things. It's to anchor the plant, and it's to absorb water and nutrients and move it up to the yielding parts of the plant. But clubroot kind of takes things over. It produces a suite of hormones within the roots and kind of takes over the function of the roots so that the root starts swelling, producing these galls in order so that it can go ahead and reproduce itself. So if you ever see a plant that looks like this, I really hope you never do. You know you've got a pretty big problem, but invariably you're more than likely going to see galls like this. This is a colleague of mine, Brittany Vischer. She works for Alberta Canola, and she just recently completed a master's degree in clubroot. So she's one of our clubroot experts in the industry. And even she, who is an expert with clubroot, still gets grossed out by it. But if you're looking for clubroot, this is typically what you're going to see are some galls either covering the entire root, or it might be just one of the side branches or one of the lateral roots that have some swelling on it. And it's not a good thing when you end up finding it. Clubroot, it usually grows in patches, meaning that when root decays, it releases the spores back into the soil, and then the next time that canola or some other brassica crop is grown in that area, then they all get infected. And so oftentimes when farmers do find clubroot for the first time, it's usually a situation like this, where you have a big brown spot in the middle of the field. And oftentimes many growers will think, well, that's just got to be a low spot. Maybe it's drowning out. Maybe it's the water is saturated. And it's not until you actually walk into that and pull up some of these plants, you see that those roots are totally covered with galls, and therefore these plants are dying from dehydration. Like they're senescing early because they can't get enough moisture because those roots are not functioning properly. So if you do see a patch like this, it's really not a good thing. Hopefully, if you do find clubroot, it is long before you see a big patch in the field, because to have a patch like this, clubroot has been in that field for a few cycles of your canola crop already. To produce a patch like this, it's been there for a few years, and you've been building it up over multiple canola crops. And what that means is that since it's been there for a long time, very likely you have dragged soil from this patch to other parts of the field and probably to other parts of your farming operation, maybe even to your neighbors if you are helping out with some operations in their farming operation. So when you find a patch like this, it's bad news. So I'm hoping that you don't find pockets like that, but you got to be looking really to know for sure. So that's kind of what clubroot looks like. You might be wondering, well, how big a deal is it? How long has it been around? And clubroot is actually one of the first described diseases in literature. And in fact, like it's some of the writings even back to the 4th century during Roman times, there's descriptions of clubroot. So it's been around for a long time. This is one of the first described diseases. But if we go over to this middle dot here, if you're wondering as to when clubroot was found in Canada, it's been in Ontario as far as we know. And I see that we have Mary Ruth McDonald here, so this is really great. She's probably can correct me on a lot of my information here. As far as we know, that it's been in Ontario for 100 years, and therefore this is one of those pathogens I think that you as growers in this province need to think that this is something you're going to have to deal with. It wasn't until 2003 that clubroot was found for the first time in canola in Alberta, just outside of Edmonton. And in that period of time, it has expanded across the prairie provinces. And I'll just give you a description or some maps to take a look at to help you understand its spread. So clubroot started in 2003, just north of Edmonton, near the small city of St. Albert, in just a dozen fields or so when it was first found. But within a very short amount of time, within 3 years, and in fact, that the industry recognized that, holy crap, this thing is, it's not staying put. It's not staying like most soil-borne diseases. It's expanding quite quickly. And it was found already within several counties around the Edmonton area within a few years. And here we are, it's almost 20 years now since the first findings. It's spread pretty much from one end of Alberta to the other. The only canola growing region in Alberta where it has not yet been found in any official surveys is in the Lethbridge area. But if I was a betting guy, I would say that it's likely there. It just hasn't been found in a survey yet. It's been in Saskatchewan for more than 10 years. It's spreading a little more slowly in Saskatchewan than it has in Alberta, and that's maybe due to the fact that Saskatchewan's a little drier than Alberta. But it is being found from the western side, from the Alberta side, all the way over to the Manitoba side. Even farmers that are farming down in the southeast corner of Saskatchewan, you might be noticing that there's no colored municipalities there. Even that area, we are advising farmers to plan that clubroot is likely in your area. It's just that no one has come forward yet to say that, hey, I found this in my field. Anytime that we do find clubroot in a new area in Saskatchewan, it always comes as a huge shock and surprise to the neighborhood. Folks get pretty upset about it, and there's a lot of blaming that usually happens with those initial discussions. But after folks get adjusted to the fact that it is in the area, invariably they find that it's actually quite widespread and that it's not usually isolated to the first farm that it's found in. The blue municipalities listed here in Saskatchewan are areas where, or fields where the pathogen has been found, but it has not been yet produced galls on any plants. And the same in Manitoba. The blue municipalities are those where the pathogen has been detected by DNA sampling. The yellow municipalities are those that have actual plant symptoms. So this disease is really spread from one end of the prairies to the other, and gone are the days where we can assume that this is not going to be a problem for us. And I believe that the story will be the same for you folks in Ontario. If I had a little bit more time, we have a pretty great video that shows how exactly clubroot works in minute detail. It shows resting spores germinating and infecting plants, and how that whole disease cycle works. I would encourage you to go to YouTube, spend 7 minutes watching it. It's not that long. Maybe have some popcorn because the music is pretty scary and it tends to frighten farmers when they watch it. But I think it is a really good resource for you just to get a better understanding of how this thing actually works. But just to give you a really brief non-7-minute presentation of how the disease work, it starts out in soil as a resting spore. These spores are really tiny. They germinate, they become flagellated zoospore, so it's got little whip hairs on them that allow it to swim, and they go on to infect roots. And then once those roots are infected, more of these zoospores are produced, and then more of the root gets infected until you get big ugly galls. And then eventually those roots decompose at the end of the season, releasing more of these resting spores. So what makes this disease pretty insidious is that these resting spores are really tough. They can lay in the soil dormant for years and years, some estimates up to 20 years, but they're also really tiny, so that in a spoonful of soil, there can be millions, even in the magnitude of multiple billions of spores in a single gram of soil. And that's a bad thing because those millions and billions of spores will produce epidemics really quite quickly. So I've got an image here that just shows you what the difference of spore concentration has in producing infection in plants. The threshold that we usually use in the industry for infection to occur is that you need roughly about 1,000 spores in a gram of soil to produce galls. So the first canola plant here on the left, it's this was research infected plants where they actually had concentrations of the spores measured. So plants that had were grown in soil with less than 1,000 spores in a gram didn't really produce any symptoms, but once you're at 1,000, you start to see some tiny galls forming on some of the side roots. 10,000 spores per gram, you start to see larger galls produced. 100,000 bigger galls, and 1,000,000 spores, then you get really big galls. Now, what's pretty bad about this is that this big ugly root here on the right-hand side, that root can potentially produce billions of spores coming off of that. So off of one root, we can get billions. I think that Mary Ruth could probably correct me on this. 15 to 16 billion spores coming off of a single root. Now that is enough spores that if you spread them all evenly over an acre, there's enough spores there that will infect every plant in that acre. So one root has the potential to infect enough plants in an entire acre. So you can go from a pretty low level of infection to a very high level of infection quite quickly if clubroot is not managed. So that's what makes this disease really tough. And that is one of the reasons why we as an industry are quite concerned about it, because once it's really heavily infested in the soil, once you're in that range of hundreds of millions to billions of spores in your soil, that really limits your options for how you can grow canola successfully. And we want to avoid that situation for you guys as much as possible. So that's the scary stuff. Let's move on to more of the good news stuff and really the good news is that this disease is manageable, and it's more manageable if you can catch it early, or just even assume that you have it now. And even though you may not have seen symptoms, if you can start managing this disease now, then you are going to be very successful at growing canola into the long term. And you won't have to worry about it to the same degree as farmers that are dealing with extremely high levels of the disease. Their management is quite challenging. So let's avoid that situation. You have a very good opportunity here if you're not dealing with very much of the disease. Okay, let's talk about the secrets to management. And we like to think about managing clubroot in the same way that you would think about like making an omelet or baking a cake, that you need to follow a recipe. So if you are making a cake, you need to follow all the steps in the recipe in order to have a successful cake at the end of the season. You don't just throw flour in a pan and throw it in the oven and expect that, well, I'll add sugar and chocolate chips later on. You have to follow everything step by step in order to be successful. And the same thing applies with clubroot, but we look at it essentially in two steps. Think about keeping clubroot low and think about keeping clubroot local. So keeping it low essentially means don't let clubroot blow up and become a bigger problem. Don't let those spores increase if they are present in your soil. And keeping them local is, if you do have spores in your soil, don't move them to other parts of your farm. Try to keep them localized in that one spot, or even better, from being introduced to your farm from maybe some other location. So this is the recipe that we have. So the local techniques that we use are reducing the chances of contaminated inputs coming into your farm. So I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail. And the second is to sanitize or use minimum till, zero till type of farming practices. We found that works really well. So I'll talk about these in detail, as I said. And to keep the spores low, there's 5 steps. Look for the disease. Use clubroot resistant cultivars or varieties. Use a 2-year break between canola crops. Control host weeds, so volunteer canola, some of the weeds that grow this disease as well, and use patch management. So let's take a look at each of these here. So keeping spores local, this is the challenge. Anywhere the soil moves, this pathogen moves. In erosion, whether it's erosion through water or it's erosion through wind, the pathogen, in fact, does like to travel in the wind. If the wind will pick up soil, it'll pick up these resting spores. In fact, like the resting spores are usually higher in the air profile than the soil particles. And so they will travel some long distances potentially if there is a lot of wind erosion that's happening. So preventing erosion is a great way to prevent this disease from moving. And we like to talk about this, particularly in the West, is that we call these clubroot spreading implements. Any type of tillage is a great way to spread clubroot, unfortunately. Tillage will spread the spores nice and evenly around the fields. And certainly when you pick up that tillage equipment, you move it to another field, clubroot is invariably hitching a ride on that equipment. And as well, by exposing the soil to more chances of wind erosion, you are making a situation where clubroot can spread a lot more effectively. So we continue advocating for minimum tillage, zero till, as a great way to kind of keep that soil in place and prevent it from moving and spreading within the farming operation. But we also know that clubroot can be introduced to a farm through multiple avenues. Seed, clubroot spores have been detected on seed that's been harvested in a field that had clubroot. And so this is not just canola seed, it's any seed. It can be wheat seed or seed from pulses, particularly those crops that are low-lying, that's where the header is scraping the ground and adding earth tag to the hopper. Those are the crops that will move clubroot more effectively in seed. But here's the good news, is that if that seed goes to a seed cleaning plant and if it's treated, then it becomes very difficult for researchers to actually detect the pathogen on that seed. So cleaning and treating seed is a good clubroot prevention strategy. But we also know that clubroot can be transferred in manure. The pathogen survives the digestive tract of ruminant animals. So if they're grazing on clubroot infested land, potentially the pathogen could be within their manure. Hay, oftentimes what farmers will do out here is if they find that they have a really heavily infested field, that they will plant it to a forage or to a hay crop, and the pathogen then starts traveling off that land in the bales. So these are some of the avenues for the pathogen to be transferred, but as well on farm machinery or any machinery that could come into your farming operation. If you're buying used equipment, there's a potential that it could be, or if you have custom operators coming into your farming operation, floater vehicles, anything that potentially could be moving mud and soil becomes a risk. And so what we do advise to producers out here is that if you are purchasing used equipment, well, make sure that it is sanitized before it comes to your farming operation. Check with your custom operators as well if they do have some sanitation procedures, just to try minimizing the risk. At the very least, simply knocking the soil off physically with a hoe or a shovel removes 90% of the risk of the pathogen coming. So these are all techniques that we can try keeping those spores local and not spreading within the farming operation or the neighborhood. But what about, how do we keep those spores low? How do we keep, if there is spores in our fields, how do we keep them from increasing? Clubroot resistant varieties, we've got a lot of them now in the industry, and this is a really good news situation, because we did not 10 years ago have barely any cultivars or varieties that were clubroot resistant. Now these are all spring types. I don't know which winter types you have available, whether or not they have clubroot. I suspect that they don't have clubroot resistance in them. Megan's shaking her head, so that means no. So there's already a risk right there. If you can't source clubroot resistant seed, then think of it this way. Like what I like to advise farmers out here is don't do the riskiest behavior. And the riskiest behavior, which we invariably find clubroot is already a big problem for, is growing susceptible varieties in a tight rotation. And by a tight rotation, I mean canola on canola, which does happen out here, or canola, wheat canola type of rotation. Using a susceptible variety in that situation is absolutely the worst management decision. It will lead to clubroot becoming a bigger problem, guaranteed. Every single time that we find clubroot in a new location, it is always that case. It's tight rotation, susceptible varieties. So what we're telling farmers now is definitely don't do that. That is not a smart way of farming to manage clubroot. No tight rotations with susceptible varieties. So, but the good news is that the majority of varieties on the market now in Western Canada for spring types are clubroot resistant. The susceptible varieties are decreasing every year. So that's getting better that way. So there's a lot to choose from. On this chart, though, you might notice that some of these varieties have couple of stars next to them, asterisks next to them. These are varieties that have a new type of clubroot resistance gene. Most of these varieties all share a very similar resistance background, but these other ones have a new resistance, and that's good, because having some diversity in our resistance genes is going to help us manage the pathogen, because unfortunately the pathogen keeps changing and is starting to overcome these resistance genes in some areas. So I talked already a little bit about crop rotation. There's been a few studies that have been done here in Canada, and they all show the same thing, that you need basically a 2-year break between canola crops for those spores the majority of the spores to die out. About 90% of those spores are gone, or they die within that 2-year break. So essentially what we're telling farmers is a 3-year rotation is the way to go. You could wait longer than 2 years. You could wait 3 years or 4 years in between canola crops. It doesn't look like there's that much more benefit. Like you get the biggest bang for your buck by waiting that 2-year break. So that's the secret. 2-year break, resistant varieties, and you can manage the spores quite effectively. But to manage them well, you have to control all the hosts for this disease, and that's our next secret to success for keeping spores low. Stinkweed, is that what you call it in Ontario as well, or is it field pennygrass out there?
Usually we call it stinkweed. Yep.
Usually stinkweed, yeah. So it's a host for this disease. Shepherd's purse. Oops, I got a formatting issue here. shepherd's purse as well. Any of the weeds that are closely related to canola, wild mustards, they all are a source for keeping this disease going, and volunteer canola, which is a pretty big problem out here, particularly for those guys that are in tighter rotations. Essentially, if you're not controlling your canola volunteers, you are growing a susceptible variety in a tight rotation, which we really don't want folks to do. So manage those weeds. And last secret is to keep the spores isolated to a patch. So this is our patch management. And forgive my my crappy artwork here, but imagine this is a canola field. You've got a road with a ditch and an approach, but imagine that you found some club roots just off of the approach. What we're recommending is to grass in that club root patch. And what that will do is to ensure that soil doesn't move outside of the patch, but also the grass species that you use there will also help stimulate those spores to germinate, and then they ultimately die because there's no canola there to infect. And so that it's a way of starting to reduce those spores. But even better would be to have another approach to that field, and to sanitize equipment when you're coming out of that field in a sanitation zone. So we do know that there are a number of growers that are using this if they know that clubroot is isolated to one patch in the field. If it's the entire field, this really is tough to do, but having a sanitation zone when you come out of this field so you don't spread the pathogen to the rest of your farming operation is actually a pretty smart idea. So that's the recipe. The more of these steps that you can use to manage clubroot, the more successful you're going to be. And I would suggest that you start thinking about these right now. Step 1 and 2, actually, here's 3 steps. Look for the disease. If you're growing spring types, use resistant cultivars. Don't use susceptible anymore. And I'm not sure what your rotations typically look like, but try to stick to at least a 2-year break with those resistant cultivars. You manage your weeds. You're not going to have a problem with clubroot. Like you'll be able to be very successful with this. But if you do use susceptible varieties in a tight rotation, if clubroot is not already on your farm, I guarantee that it will be there soon, and you will be having some problems. And then you'll be looking at growing canola once every 5 or 6 years as you're waiting for the spores to really decrease. So our industry is very involved in clubroot. We've been investing very heavily in research, and so as I said, we have a researcher on this call, Dr. Mary Ruth McDonald, who is one of our famous researchers. Canada, ever since finding clubroot in 2003, has invested millions and millions of dollars into trying to get ahead of this disease. And we've been successful on that front in that we've come up with a lot of new strategies, new resistance, understanding the genetics and how this disease actually works. We're now in a leadership position in the world. Like researchers from around the world come to Canada to understand how to manage this disease. So we are making progress, but there's still a ways to go. We don't have immunity. It would be really nice if we didn't have to ever worry about this disease again. But what we're working on right now is just coming up with better ways of identifying what type of resistance we have in our varieties, so we can tell farmers, particularly those that are in the Alberta area where they have resistance starting to fail because the pathogens changed in their field, what type of resistance that they need to move to next in order to try staying ahead of the disease. So that's where I want to conclude things. Canola is a big deal for us here in Canada, but clubroot is a big deal as well, because this is one of our biggest threats to the sustainability of this crop in the long term. But you have an opportunity ahead of you that if you start taking steps to manage it now, you won't have to worry about it in your farming operation, and you'll be definitely a lot more successful than your neighbors who are maybe not taking these steps. So I wish you well, and I think that's where, oh yeah, I should make a plug. If you ever have any questions about clubroot, feel free to reach out to me, but we do have really good resources online in the Canola Encyclopedia. If you're not signed up for our weekly newsletter during the growing season called Canola Watch, we've got tons of information on how to manage clubroot and all other diseases and pests, and how to be successful with growing your canola crop. That comes on a weekly basis, and no advertisements. We're not selling anything. We're just providing information on how to be successful with this crop. So sign up for that. If you have any questions on signing up, let me know and I'll get you signed up. And thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here, Megan. I love talking about clubroot.
That's great. Thank you so much, Clint. It's great to have you. Yeah, and if you don't get Clint's contact info there, I can always pass you on to sign up for Canola Watch, or the Canola Digest magazine is also a pretty excellent resource. Okay, so I have a few questions that were in the chat, and I'm hoping to get, let's say, 3 more questions. So if anybody out there, you want to type your question in the chat, I'd love to have 3 more, and or raise your hand and we'll get to you. So I'll also say, while we go through these questions, Dr. Mary Ruth McDonald, since your name has come up like 5 or 6 times, if you want to further expand on the answers to any of these questions, we would love that. And Mary Ruth is in Ontario, so she does kind of have an idea. I talk to her regularly about the situation here. Thanks so much, Mary Ruth. Okay, so one question we had is, what % control do resistant varieties offer?
So that is a really good question. For a variety to officially have an R rating for clubroots, you need to demonstrate that you reduce the disease by 70%. So there still is 30% infection. This pathogen is really tough. Like unfortunately, we're not dealing with just one race or pathotype or variant. It has a slew of genetic variation there that invariably, even if you are growing the best resistance in the marketplace, you're still going to see some infection, just because there's so many pathotypes that are already present, usually in a field or in a patch, and there's usually one that'll get around it. So we don't have complete control. We can, when a variety has an R rating, or they're considered to be resistant, they get the majority of the pathogen. But one thing that we need to do better as an industry, and we're moving towards that, is to be able to identify what pathotypes and what races are present in a field, or what are the predominant ones, and then choose the resistance gene that's going to best work against that. That's where we want to get to, but we're still a few years away from that, unfortunately. So resistant varieties are not going to give you complete control, unfortunately.
Yes, I found a tiny club on a resistant variety this year, or last year, sorry, in a field. I had to look pretty hard for it, but it was there. Okay, another question was, wondering if you can expand on reducing the impact of clubroot spread from hay in say you have a 5 or 6 year rotation. You mentioned hay bales carrying clubroot, so if you could comment on that a little further.
So there's a lot of factors that go into this, and we observed this for the first time. What year was that? That would have been back, I think, in 2012 or 2013. We had a producer who in the Edmonton area who had just broken some land that it was in pasture for a number of years. And typically what a lot of farmers do out here is when they break pasture or hay land, that they'll put canola in as their first crop, usually Roundup Ready canola, easy to control the weeds in that. And he planted canola there, and he ended up having a patch of clubroot. So he was like, how the heck did this get here? Like, I've never had canola. It's been pasture forever. There shouldn't be any of the pathogen in the soil. And what we traced it back to was that he had that's where he was storing his hay bales. It was his stack of bales was right there. And in fact, this patch was exactly delineated where that hay bale patch was, and the spores, just through weathering, had rained down out of these bales into the field. We didn't really think that hay was going to be a big issue, but it really depends upon what the field that it's coming from. Like, if the field is really heavily infested, like in the billions of spores type of range, then the potential of that earth tag that's going with those bales is significant, that it could be moving there. But if it's unknown, like if clubroot is not known to be in that field at all, then I would say the risks are quite a bit less. And it really comes down to the soil and the haying conditions in that, which if they're picking up a lot of soil as they're forming their bales and that, then it becomes a bigger risk as well. So what we try to advise growers to think about is, think about it in these terms: whatever moves the greatest quantity of soil onto your land is the biggest risk, particularly if that soil is coming out of known clubroot fields. So anything, like oftentimes we'll have farmers out here they'll be, well, how did I get clubroot in my field? It must be the geese that brought it in. And we're like, well, hypothetically, that is possible, that you could have a goose that has a couple spores attached to its foot or its wing. They're not going to be moving very many grams or kilograms of soil. It's going to be big equipment that moves the greatest quantity. And in most cases, when we find clubroot new to a field, we can trace it back to farm equipment for the most part. There are some situations where it might be construction equipment or oil patch equipment. But invariably 99% of the time it's farm machinery, and usually tillage or seeding equipment are the bigger culprits in that realm.
Yeah, since you mention it, so thank you for that answer. Tillage is different in Ontario than in the West.
Yeah.
We are conducting more tillage, and there are, some good reasons for that. But I often see clubroot not really in a patch. Sometimes it's not appearing at the field entrance, and it's not in a very distinct patch. I've seen it in a stream through a little water course through a field. So there is one question here. We're seeing a lot of clubroot pressure in low-lying areas of fields, even recently cleared fields. How far can spores travel in water, which may be an impossible question to answer, but and how probable is it that spores are coming in from the ditch? Resistant varieties are still having a lot of clubroot.
Yeah, okay. So that's a good question. I don't know that we've done a lot of studies measuring spore movement in water, but I would frame it in this respect. If there's a potential that soil is moving from either ditches or from one field to another, then there's the potential that the pathogen is moving. And certainly if you are finding clubroot, maybe not in a patch right next to the field entryway where the wings of a cedar open up, or the cultivator or disker first enters the soil. And we have seen quite a few cases of this as well. It's usually the first slough or the lower lying area that clubroot is found around. And that's just because this pathogen, it loves soil, it loves moisture. It needs soil moisture to go through the infection process. And so the wetter the area is, typically we're going to see greater levels of the disease. The disease might be introduced in the field entryway, but invariably we drag the soil down to these lower lying areas of the fields. And then that's where it actually starts to build up and start the infection process. If that's the case, like if you're not finding it right in the patch next to the field entry point, and you're finding it down in the lower lying area, that's not a great news situation, because then it usually means that the pathogen has been in your field for a while and it's starting to build up there. And as a result, it's starting, the likelihood that you've already dragged that soil off that field to another field in your farming operation, is the likelihood goes up.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And this map is a little bit old. I probably updated it in 2019, but if you're farming in these areas where we have the red and yellow dots, your neighbors or you have clubroot. So, those are the high risk areas. We haven't sampled out at Rainy River yet, to my knowledge. We do have a couple samples there in Thunder Bay. But other than Eastern Ontario, you're probably farming in an area where we know we have clubroot, and those red dots, we have had yield loss to clubroot.
That's a great map. Can we get a copy of that and put it on our clubroot.ca website?
Yeah, I've shared it in the West a little bit, but I'm happy to do that and maybe start to update it. Yeah, sure. Okay. So, I guess maybe a follow-up question. are there some fields in the West where you've lost control even with resistant varieties? And I think I know the answer to that question, but
Yeah, it was in 2013 was the first year that we had resistant varieties demonstrate higher levels of clubroot than what we would expect. Like we always expect that there's going to be a few plants that potentially could be infected, maybe just that there could be volunteers in a field, or it could be just off types within the variety. But 2013 was the first case where we actually had full patches in the field where the resistance wasn't working. And we'd identified that there's a new pathotype that was capable of overcoming that. Unfortunately, that has now become quite common, particularly in the Edmonton area. We know of hundreds of fields where resistance is no longer working in those fields, at least the first form of resistance, kind of what people are calling generation 1 resistance or first generation resistance. So that's becoming more and more common, that there are pathotypes that will overcome it. And it's not just one pathotype, there's a suite of them that are capable of overcoming that resistance. The newer forms of resistance look like they are holding against these pathotypes, these newer pathotypes, but there seems to be some indication that there might even be some other newer pathotypes that are able to overcome these next generation or second generation resistance types. So unfortunately, the resistance isn't going to hold, and I would not be surprised if the situation is going to be the same in Ontario. And I don't know if Mary Ruth wants to chime in here, whether or not you've identified some fields where resistance is no longer functional in Ontario.
Yeah, we've definitely identified a few fields where the clubroot can overcome the first generation resistance. And there's 1 or 2 fields where there's a question about overcoming second generation resistance. So same thing happening in Alberta, just on a smaller scale.
thank you, Mary Ruth. So we do have a question here. Are there plans to do any more widespread clubroot testing for pathotypes? And, you know, Mary Ruth and I have tried to share with growers that if you want to send in samples of plants or of soil, we're willing to test those and just get a hold of us and send that over. But you know, how important is it to know the pathotype in your field, and how easy is that to do? And I wondered if Mary Ruth could expand on what that testing looks like, because it's not super straightforward.
Right, it's not easy at this stage. And Clint mentioned all the clubroot researchers. There are at least 3 groups in Canada trying to find simple molecular tests to identify pathotypes, but we're not there yet. So we get a soil sample, we have to grow out susceptible plants in the soil to get clubs, which is 6 or 8 weeks in a greenhouse or growth room. Then we have to take those clubs and inoculate 5 or 6 different varieties, different lines, to determine the pathotype. And then if it shows that it's got the first generation resistance, and we have to grow it on 6 more different lines. So it can be up to 6 months to figure out a pathotype from a soil sample. You can send us a nice big Ziploc bag of clubs, then it's a little bit easier and faster. And definitely, we're very interested in determining pathotypes, at least now for the next few years.
That's great. Thank you, Mary Ruth. And so otherwise, in terms of testing for clubroot, so we're scouting, we're checking plants. What's the best, before I ask the question, I guess, you can take a soil sample and submit it to quite a few of the labs in Ontario and get a yes, no, I have clubroot. So it doesn't really tell you about the pathotype, but you can find out if your field has clubroot. And there have been cases, those yellow dots on my map, where we took a soil sample, we know that there was clubroot there, and we didn't always see infected plants, but it definitely made those growers aware that, okay, the risk is higher for them because we're able to detect clubroot DNA. So what is the best time to scout then? And the best way of scouting, I guess?
Yeah. Well, like identifying galls on plants is the surest way to know whether you have a problem. Usually you're not going to see this happening until the crop is bolting, or so just starting the flowering process. It becomes the easiest to identify the closer you get to harvest, swath timing. Usually that's where you will see some plants that are dying ahead of other ones, and the visual differences become easier to see above ground. So once you get past the rosette stage, pulling plants, looking for galls, looking for any swellings on roots is the easiest and perhaps one of the more effective ways. It's not going to give you an absolute answer as to whether or not that the pathogen is present in the soil. Soil testing has a pretty good success, but it's only as good as the sample that you take. Unfortunately, I would not use samples that are taken for fertility analysis. You usually only want the top 2 inches of soil, because that's usually where the greatest amount of root material is usually present. And so that's where you want to sample and try to think strategically where clubroot more than likely will be. Like if you're concerned that you have a field that maybe you had a custom seeder come into a couple of years ago, and you're thinking, well, maybe they could have brought clubroot, I would go to the spot where that seeder opened up and first started dragging the openers through the soil, and pick some soil from a few spots or right around that area. Or if you have some suspected areas that last year you had canola there, but you don't have any canola this year, you could go, think that there might have been a patch where you saw something looking weird, go there and take some soil samples of the top 2 inches, and put it into a Ziploc bag and send that away for analysis. And so that thing is pretty good. It's going to give you a yes, no, like that. They use a DNA test, a PCR test that will detect the DNA of this pathogen. So if it gives you a yes, the risks of false positives are not very great, then you know with some confidence that you've got an issue. You're on mute, Megan.
There we go. I just shared, this is just a random tweet I found when I was looking on Twitter. So if you think you have sclerotinia and you have patches of sclerotinia in the field, you know, any place where it's drying down or looking that straw colored early, check those areas, right?
Yep.
Get out of the combine and have a look.
Yeah. Anything that prematurely dries, you should take a look at it. Clubroot, Sclerotinia black. We have another new pathogen out here in the West, a new disease called verticillium stripe, and it seems to be more predominant in Western Manitoba currently, but same type of thing that we are finding patches of it, and it's killing the crop, causing it to dry down prematurely. You got to know what's in your field. If you don't know, then you can't manage it, and you're always going to be behind the ball for maximizing your yield potential.
Great. We did have a question about freeze thaw cycles and snow insulating, slowing the breakdown of clubroot or speeding it up. And basically those aren't really factors. It's, clubroot can remain dormant for a long time, at least a percentage of those spores. So that's actually a good question. And I don't think I have a good answer as to what are the environmental conditions that are going to lead to more breakdown of the resting spores or of the pathogen in the soil. My understanding is it's usually going to be biological activity, like other things that are degrading, rotting the resting spores. Maybe Mary Ruth might have a better understanding of it, but snow cover, soil temperature, I don't know of any conditions that really speed up the decrease of spores in the soil.
Right, Clint. If freezing killed it, you wouldn't have a problem in Western Canada. And it seems that a freeze thaw cycle doesn't have much effect on that last percent of the resting spores that just seem to survive forever.
I think, Mary Ruth, you in fact store resting spores in a -85 freezer. So
Well,
ultra low
and
temperatures.
we don't even need to do that. Just regular -20 freezer keeps them very well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question, and then maybe we'll try to have some other discussion, but please feel free to raise your hand or put any more questions in the chat. I'd love to get a couple more, but we did have one about cover crops and tillage radish. So, and I know Mary Ruth has done some work on this. So we do some cover cropping in Ontario. There are some brassica species in those cover crops. And, you know, good rule of thumb is that brassicas are susceptible to clubroot and swede midge. Those can contribute to local populations. But Mary Ruth has looked at tillage radish specifically. So that's like a trademark name. And it's more of a cousin to canola than it is like a sister, right, Mary Ruth? So far,
Right.
tillage radish, if you wanted to elaborate, not as susceptible to clubroot.
Right. We looked at, I think, 4 different of the tillage type of radishes, and they were all 100% resistant in our greenhouse trials. So that was really good. Megan was asking me earlier about some of the other brassica cover crops, and we haven't looked at them, like oilseed radish and some of the others. We haven't looked at them that carefully. So that was a great idea for work that we're going to do this coming year. But other brassicas, like the biofumigant brassicas, are way more susceptible even than canola. So, so you do have to be selective about which cover crops you use. And I think it's a note about cover crops in the or brassicas in the mixture of cover crops, and that's really important to think about as well.
So no pressure, Mary Ruth, but let's see if you can get those resistance genes out of that tillage radish as quickly as possible into canola
Yeah,
and other
right.
brassicas.
Right.
You're going to start plant breeding now as well, Mary Ruth. We'll spread you even thinner. Okay, well, thank you so much, Clint. We're still kind of on the line for a bit longer if people want to have further discussion, but I just want to make sure we thank you for joining us and bringing your expertise to Ontario. And thank you, Mary Ruth, for jumping in as well. In theory, we were going to have a discussion, you know, focused on the kind of central canola growing region and talk about challenges or opportunities there. We are seeing a decline in canola acreage in that area, and maybe a little uptick in winter canola. But I noticed from the participant list, most of you are from the Northeast. So, and that's where clubroot has had the biggest impact so far. So I'm not sure if we're in a position to have a conversation on Bruce Gray here on Dufferin, but does anybody have anything they want to talk about aside from clubroot, about cropping this year, or while we have a Western Canadian farmer on the line, any other questions at all? Feel free.
Hi, it's Emily here. I just jumped on, so I missed everything else that happened in the meeting. I was just wondering what the moisture situation is like out there. I don't know if you touched on this or not out in the West, hearing that it didn't really build up the reserves much over winter, and just kind of wondering what the feel is out there.
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, we definitely experienced a bad drought here this last year, and
yeah,
it was definitely the worst drought that we've had in the last 70 years. But there's some meteorologists that are saying that this is probably the worst drought that we've had in well, ever since we've broken soil here for the last 130, 140 years. So that was pretty bad. But coming out of harvest by November, we started getting some regular rainfall. Some of that was able to penetrate the soil through most of the black soil zones right now. So I don't know if you're familiar with the geography of the prairie provinces, but kind of following the boreal forest line, we have a layer of high organic matter, what we call the black soil zones. It's the prime canola growing area. Sometimes it's called Aspen Parkland region. We actually have very good snow cover across most of this area right now. And in my intro, I was describing the snow in my yard currently right now. I've never seen this much snow. I'm constantly getting my snowmobile stuck. I need to get a big mountain sled that has a long track on it to be able to navigate it here. So that's really good. Like we're going to have very good soil runoff, and so there will be some recharging that'll be happening certainly in the lower areas. The exception to this is southern Alberta. Calgary south still hasn't received very much snow cover or rainfall over the winter months, and so that area, the drought still could be persisting, but so far what it looks like, we'll be going into some moist soils for seeding time in May once we get out to the field.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Emily and Clint. So any other comments or questions? We do have one, well, at least one Canola Growers Association director delegate on the line. Curtis, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am kind of wondering, what is the vibe out of that Bruce Gray Huron? You know, are we going to continue to see spring canola acres decline? And we've had dry conditions that have kind of hampered our ability to grow a quality crop there. Anybody have any comments out of the region? Or Emily, you're in Wellington.
Yeah, I think that with the corn and bean price being so high that you'll see some canola acres lost, because it's just so easy to make money growing something else that I think, I could be wrong, but I think I don't hear a lot of farmers talking to me about canola acres when they bring up their discussion of rotation. It's interesting because I almost never heard anybody talk about rotating acres out of their swing acres. I just didn't think they really were much of a thing in Ontario, of my experience buying grain from people and over the years. But this year, it's a lot more thought going into those swing acres and I guess we have a winter wheat problem, so that creates swing acres. But
this year, yeah.
This year.
Yeah, winter wheat not looking its best this year, and maybe not as many acres in the ground as we hoped. Although it's over 750,000, which was a big number compared to what we were expecting. And so Emily, maybe that it's easier to make money on corn and beans, but that bump in yield that winter canola gives you is maybe part of the reason you decided to grow some winter canola.
Yeah, try it again, one more year, see how many years we do it, and it works. We'll see how long it works for.
Yeah, fair enough. And the first grower I worked with winter canola had 3 excellent crops, and whenever people ask him, for tips and stuff, he says, "Do you want me to talk you into it or talk you out of it?" Because he had strong yields, but there are challenges. So
yeah.
All right,
Emily. That Terry Phillips, that the winter wheat crop going in so late, because a lot of that 700 whatever number was really planted late in adverse conditions, even after beans. So do you think if there's enough wrecks there that our position was always canola was the crop when you want to get your wheat in on time, and do you think that'll pull some acres back? Or if the winter wheat kind of survives, will guys say, geez, I can plant a lot later than I thought, and keep playing in that game?
I think that they'll just think about beans as much as they can. And I don't even think they'll think of early day beans. I think they'll think of last year as an anomaly, and they'll just grow as many bean bushels as they can.
Is fertilizer factoring into that bean choice as well?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, seems to be. For sure. And I mean, most is locked in, so that helps, but just the price is phenomenal for beans.
Yeah.
And we don't get a lot of traction when we talk about shorter maturity soybeans. We get almost no traction when we talk about that, which is understandable. Okay, well, it is 10 after 2. Anything else we want to talk about? Curtis, how are you guys still growing spring canola this year? If you're still with us, maybe not.
Yep, I'm here. No, we won't have any spring canola this year, just due to, like Emily said, bean prices are so good where they are, and now you gotta, with canola, you gotta start talking about nitrogen, and that really plays a huge role in what you're growing too. And it's for beans, you don't need it, and you can, I guess, riding that price, we have it booked in for our corn and wheat now, and we haven't planned on canola anyways.
Yep, fair enough. All right. Well, I don't like to keep people when there's not much to talk about, but any final questions or comments? I will throw up our poster, hoping to get more, getting people out to the meeting next week. We have Keith Gabbert, so he's a colleague of Clint's and a great guy, always answers the phone when I call him and bug him with questions. And he helped me scout for clubroot in the Northeast one time and wants to come back. So that's cool. He's a cool guy. Talking about flea beetle and diamondback moth and other insects, and some of our Northwestern growers that are a little newer to growing canola, spring canola, are being caught off guard sometimes by these pests. So everybody has issues with flea beetle. So we'll focus in on that pest again. And then a seeding conversation the week after with Dane Fraze, and following up March 9th with a winter canola discussion that I'm really looking forward to. One last question for you, Clint. I was asked this privately in the chat. Are there crop specialists like me that work for the provincial government in Alberta and Saskatchewan? I know obviously in Manitoba, because Dane is one of them, but do you guys still have that out there?
Saskatchewan still does. Corey Jacobs is the oilseed specialist for Saskatchewan. Alberta, they went through some really big restructuring in their ag department and no longer has a canola or an oilseed specialist position, which is unfortunate. Murray Hartman used to be that individual, but he retired 2 years ago.
And then
great resource to the industry.
Yes, I talked to Murray a few times in my early years too. And so when he retired, they didn't replace him, eh?
No, unfortunately. Yeah.
It was a wealth of knowledge.
But speaking of good resources and wealth of knowledge, if I didn't come clear before that I'm a fan of Mary Ruth, you guys have a fantastic resource right there with clubroot expertise. Like when the world comes knocking on Canada's door for clubroot expertise, Mary Ruth is the person. So you guys have a really fantastic person there in Ontario. Absolutely.
And my understanding is you can only get pathotyping done at Mary Ruth's lab or at University of Saskatchewan. Is that?
University of Alberta.
Sorry.
Steve Strelkoff's lab as well. Yeah.
Right. Very good. All right. Well, thank you again, Clint. And if you guys have nothing else you want to talk about, then let's move on with our day. I'll stay on the line for 5 more minutes, but yeah, that's kind of all we have for now.
Nice talking with you all.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.